Raskolnikov dreamed a terrible dream. He dreamed of the time when he was a child and when they still lived in their little provincial town. He was a boy of 7. It was a holiday, late in the afternoon, and he was out for a walk in the country with his father. It was a dull and sultry day, and the place was exactly as he remembered it. Even in his memory it was not as distinct as he saw it now in his dream. The little town stood on an open, flat plain, and they could see it clearly spread out before their eyes. There was not a willow anywhere near to obstruct their view. Only somewhere far away could they catch a glimpse of a dark wood outlined faintly on the rim of the sky. A few yards from the last kitchen garden in the town stood a pub, a big pub which had always made a most unpleasant impression on him, and even made him feel afraid every time he passed it with his father as they went for their walk. There were always such crowds of people there, people who were always yelling, laughing, cursing, and singing so hideously and hoarsely. And very often they had regular fights with one another. And around the pub they always met such horribly drunken people that every time they came across them he clung close to his father, trembling all over. Not far from the pub was a road, a rough country road, which was always dusty, and the dust on it was always very black. It stretched windingly away in the distance, and about 300 yards farther on it turned to the right, skirting the town cemetery. In the middle of the cemetery was a stone church with a green cupola, to which he used to go twice a year to morning mass with his father and mother. When a service was held in memory of his grandmother, who had long been dead and whom he had never seen. For the service they always used to take with them a special funeral dish on a white plate and wrapped in a white napkin. And the funeral dish was of sweetened rice and raisins stuck into it in the shape of a cross. He loved that church with its ancient icons, mostly without settings, and the old priest with the shaking head. Beside the grave of his grandmother, which was covered with a gravestone, was the little grave of his 6-month-old brother, whom he had also never known and could not remember. He had been told, however, that he had a little brother, and every time he visited the cemetery he used to cross himself over the grave religiously and reverently, and bow down and kiss it. And now he dreamt that his father and he were walking along the road to the cemetery and were passing the pub. He was holding his father's hand and gazing fearfully at the pub. A particular circumstance attracted his attention. This time there seemed to be some sort of an outing there. A crowd of artisans' wives, in their best finery, peasant women and their husbands, and all sorts of riff-raff. They were all drunk and they were singing songs. Near the front steps of the pub stood a cart, but it was a very strange cart. It was one of those large carts usually drawn by a large dray horses and used for the transportation of goods and casks of vodka. He always liked watching those huge dray horses with their long manes and thick legs, walking leisurely with measured steps and drawing a whole mountain behind them, but without the slightest strain, as though they found it so much easier going with carts than without carts. But now, curiously enough, some peasant's small, lean, greyish-brown mare was harnessed to one of these huge carts, the sort of poor old nag which he had seen it so often, found it very hard to draw quite an ordinary cart with wood or hay piled on the top of it, especially when the cart was stuck in the mud or in a rut. And every time that happened, the peasant flogged her so brutally, sometimes across the eyes and muzzle, and he felt so sorry for the poor old horse, that he almost burst into tears. And his mother always used to take him away from the window. But now, in front of the pub, pandemonium suddenly broke loose. Crowd of blind drunk big peasants in red and blue shirts, with their coats thrown over their shoulders, came out of the pub, yelling and singing and strumming at their balalaikas. "Come on, get on my cart," shouted one of them, quite a young peasant with a terrible thick neck and a very red beefy face. "I'll drive you all home, get in!" But almost immediately there was an outburst of loud laughter and shouts. "Look at that old nag of his, drive us all home, will he? Have you lost your senses, Mikolka? What made you put such an old weed in a big cart like that? The mare is 20, if she's a day, lads. Come on, I'll drive you all home," Mikolka shouted again, jumping into the cart before everyone else, picking up the reins, standing, drawn up to his full height in front. "Matvey has taken the bay," he shouted from the cart. "And this here old nag of mine, lads, is just breaking my heart. I should have cut her throat long ago. Doesn't earn her keep. She doesn't. Come on, I say. Get in, all of you. I'll make her jump. I'll make her go on a galloping all the way. You'll see. She'll go a galloping all the way." He took the whip in his hands, preparing himself gleefully to whip the little grey-brown mare. "Come along, let's get in." Laughing voices were raised in the crowd. "Do you hear? He'll make her galloping all the way. I bet she's never gone galloping for 10 years or more. She'll be skipping along. Don't spare her, lads. Take your whips, all of you. Ready? Serves her right. Give her a good flogging." They all got into Mikolka's cart, laughing and joking. 6 men clambered into the cart, and there was still room for more. They took a fat, red-cheeked peasant woman with them. She wore a red cotton dress, the traditional headdress of a married woman, ornamented with beads, and fur-lined boots, and she was cracking nuts and just smiling to herself. In the crowd, too, people were laughing, and indeed, and how could they help laughing? The mare was all skin and bones, and there she was supposed to drag such a heavy load at a gallop. 2 young lads in the cart at once took a whip each and got ready to help Mikolka. There was a shout, "Gee up!" and the poor mare started pulling away with all her might, but far from galloping, could scarcely manage to move the cart, one step at a time, working away helplessly with her legs, snorting and cowering under the blows of 3 whips, which were belaboring her mercilessly. The laughter in the cart and in the crowd was redoubled, but Mikolka was beginning to lose his temper, and in his fury he showered blow after blow on the helpless mare, as though he really thought that she could gallop. "Let me lend you a hand, lads," a young fellow in the crowd cried, his fingers itching to have a go at the old mare. "Come on, get in, all of you," Mikolka shouted. "She'll take you all. I'll flog the life out of her." And he went on flogging and flogging, in his blind fury, hardly knowing what to hit her with. "Daddy, Daddy," he cried to his father. "Daddy, look what they are doing. Daddy, they are beating the poor little horse." Come along, son," said his father. "They are drunk, they're having fun, the fools. Come along, don't look." And he tried to take him away, but he tore himself out of his father's hands and, hardly realizing what he was doing, ran to the old horse. But the poor old mare was already in a very bad state. She was gasping for breath, standing still, pulling at the cart again, and almost collapsing in the road. "Flog her to death!" shouted Mikolka. "I don't mind, I'm going to flog her to death myself." "Why, you devil!" shouted an old man in the crowd. "Ain't you got the fear of a god in you? Whoever saw a poor old nag like that pulling such a big load?" added another. "You'll flog her to death!" shouted a third. "Mind your own business. She's my property, ain't she? I'll damn well do what I like with her. Come on, there's a plenty of room. Come on, all of you. I'm going to make her gallop, if it's the last thing I do." A loud peal of laughter suddenly drowned everything. Unable to stand the rain of the blows from the whips any longer, the poor beast started kicking helplessly. Even the old man could not help smiling. And, to be sure, such a bag of bones, now there she was kicking. Two lads in the crowd also armed themselves with whips and ran to the mare, intending to flog her from each side. They ran to take up their positions. "Whip her across the muzzle!" shouted Mikolka. "Across the eyes! Whip her across the eyes! Let's have a song, lads!" Someone in the cart shouted, and everyone in the cart took up the cry. They started singing a boisterous song, and a tambourine tinkled, and there was shrill whistling during the refrains. The young peasant woman went on cracking nuts and smiling to herself. He ran beside the old mare. He ran in front of her. He saw her being whipped across her eyes, across the very eyes. He was crying. His heart heaved and tears rolled down his cheeks. One of the men who were flogging the horse grazed his face with the whip, but he felt nothing. Wringing his hands and screaming, he rushed up to the old man with a grey beard, who was shaking his head and condemning it all. A woman took him by the hand and tried to lead him away, but he freed himself and ran back to the poor old horse, which seemed to be at the last gasp, but started kicking once more. "Oh, to hell with you!" shouted Mikolka furiously, and throwing down his whip, he bent down and dragged out a long, thick shaft from the bottom of the cart. Taking hold of it by one end with both hands, he swung it with an effort over the grey-brown mare. "He'll strike her dead!" they shouted all round. "He'll kill her!" "My property!" shouted Mikolka, and let fall the shaft with all his might. There was the sound of a heavy thud. "Flog her! Flog her! Why have you stopped?" Shouts were heard in the crowd, and Mikolka swung the shaft another time, and another terrific blow fell across the back of the unhappy mare. She subsided on her haunches, but presently was on her feet again, pulling with all her remaining strength, first on one side and then on another, trying to move the cart. But they were belaboring her from every side with 6 whips, and the shaft was raised again and fell the third and then the 4th time, slowly and with terrific force. Mikolka was furious because he had not been able to kill her with one blow. "Alive and kicking!" they shouted on all sides. "But she'll fall down any minute now, lads," shouted a sportsman in the crowd. "She's about finished. Why don't you strike her with an axe? Dispatch her at once!" A third one shouted. "Oh, damn her! Make way!" Mikolka yelled furiously, and throwing down the shaft, he once more bent down in the cart and pulled out an iron bar. "Mind!" he shouted, swinging it with all his might over his poor old horse. The bar came down with a crash, and the old mare swayed, subsided, and was about to give another pull at the cart, when the bar once again descended on her back with terrific force, and she collapsed on the ground as though her forelegs had given way from under her all at once. "Finish her off!" Mikola shouted, jumping down from the cart, blind with rage. A few young men, also red-faced and drunk, seized whatever they could lay their hands on, whips, sticks, the shaft, and ran to the dying mare. Mikola stood on one side and started raining blows across her back with the iron bar without bothering to see where the blows were falling. The mare stretched out her head, heaved a deep sigh, and died. "Settled her!" they shouted in the crowd. "Why didn't she gallop? My property!" shouted Mikolka, iron bar in hand and with bloodshot eyes. He stood there as though he was sorry he had nothing more to flog. "Hey, you ain't got the fear of God in you after all!" Many voices were already shouting in the crowd, but by now the poor little boy was beside himself. He pushed his way through the crowd to the grey-brown mare, put his arms round her dead, blood-stained muzzle, and kissed her on the eyes, on the lips. Then he suddenly jumped to his feet and rushed in a rage at Mikolka with his little fists. But just then his father, who had been running after him, caught hold of him at last and carried him out of the crowd. "Come along, son, come along," he said to him. "Let's go home." "Daddy, why? Why did they kill the poor little horse?" he whimpered, but suddenly his breath failed and the words came in shrieks from his panting breast. "They are drunk," said his father. "Playing with the fool. It's not our business. Come along." He put his arms around his father, but his chest tightened and he felt choked. He tried to draw a breath, to cry out, and woke up. Raskolnikov woke up in a cold sweat, his hair wet with perspiration, gasping for breath, and he raised himself in terror. "Oh, thank God, it was only a dream," he said, sitting down under a tree and drawing deep breaths. "But what's the matter with me? These are not the symptoms of a fever, are they? What a horrible dream!"